Hey everybody, I'm Zale Mednick, and welcome to another episode of Preconceived. If you listen to your podcast on YouTube, we have started uploading most of our episodes onto YouTube, so you are welcome to listen to or watch us there, or you can continue, as you've been doing for the last 6 years, listening to our podcast on audio. The war between Israel and Gaza has been ongoing for close to 2 years. The heinous crimes of October 7th were a shock to Israelis, Jews worldwide, and many people around the world. Since then, as the war has raged on for almost 700 days, Israel has sought to defeat Hamas and get back its hostages. But with it has come a massive price. Tens of thousands of Palestinians have died. While the numbers vary and it's challenging to distinguish Hamas casualties from civilian casualties, there is no denying that many innocent civilians have been killed in the fighting. In an effort to destroy Hamas, Netanyahu's government has pursued a massive ground incursion. Estimates vary, but even conservative approximations would agree that at least 50%, probably much more, of Gaza infrastructure has been destroyed, and over 90% of Gazan civilians have had to flee their homes. A food crisis looms with a potential famine on the horizon. Hospitals have been destroyed, and those that still exist are at capacity with limited functioning. In short, the situation for Palestinian civilians in Gaza has become a living nightmare. But who is to blame for this? Hamas is a known terrorist organization with a history of using their own civilians as human shields. They have a massive underground tunnel system, which has made it almost impossible for Israel to defeat Hamas without destroying significant amounts of infrastructure in order to access these underground tunnels. Hostages and Hamas members have been hidden in civilian areas, and Israel has had to inflict civilian damage in order to achieve its cited military goals. Hamas has been extremely difficult to negotiate with. They still have hostages, and Hamas refuses to surrender or even acknowledge Israel's existence. On the other side of the coin, in Israel's quest to defeat Hamas and get back the hostages, has the country gone too far? Has there been an unacceptable amount of Palestinian civilian casualties in the name of defeating Hamas? And if so, does this classify as genocide, as many in the international community are claiming? While some see the situation in black and white, to many, the situation is extremely complex and gray. Over the past few years, I've run several episodes exploring the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict from multiple perspectives. Those of an Israeli tour guide, a Jewish professor from Harvard, and a Palestinian professor from Brown. They have offered different vantage points on the history that has led to the present conflict. I encourage you to listen to those episodes to better understand Zionism, the history of Israel's creation, and the wars of 1948, 1967, and beyond. But now, as claims of genocide mount against Israel for the dire situation that has emerged in Gaza, I felt it was important to do one more set of episodes exploring these particular charges of genocide. Preconceived originated out of a desire to better understand the world and to search for truth. When the status quo says one thing, are we just to believe it, or are we to critically investigate it? I am Jewish, and Israel is a country that has emotional significance to me and many of the people that I know. This is a difficult topic to discuss, but an important one. In this episode and the next, I am joined by two guests to explore the accusation that Israel is committing genocide. The first guest on today's episode is Omer Bartov, an Israeli and former member of the IDF who recently wrote a New York Times feature claiming that Israel was indeed committing genocide. In next week's episode, I will speak with genocide scholar Jeffrey Herf, who claims that such cries of genocide are unfounded and devoid of any context. On to today's episode with Omer Bartov. Born in Israel and educated at Tel Aviv University and St. Anthony's College, Oxford, Omer Bartov's early research concerned the Nazi indoctrination of the Wehrmacht and the crimes committed in World War II, analyzed in his books The Eastern Front, 1941 to 1945, and Hitler's Army. He then turned to the links between total war and genocide, discussed in his books Murder in Our Midst, Mirrors of Destruction, and Germany's War and the Holocaust. His interest in representation also led to his study, The quote, Jew in Cinema, which examines the recycling of anti-Semitic stereotypes in film. His more recent work has focused on inter-ethnic relations in the borderlands of Eastern Europe. As mentioned earlier, he recently published a feature article in the New York Times claiming that what is going on in Gaza is a genocide. All right, Professor Omer Bartov, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So, as I just outlined in the introduction, this is a difficult topic for many people to talk about. You're a Jew as well. You're Israeli. You grew up in Israel. You served in the IDF. And I think for me, that's one of the reasons that your article in the Times was so thought-provoking and generated such a response from many people. Many Jews, myself included, are struggling right now with this complex situation in Israel and Gaza, reconciling October 7th with the undeniable disaster that has occurred in Gaza and is occurring in Gaza. I wonder if you could just explain why, to people listening to this might be hard for many Jews, this situation.
Well, look, I mean, of course it's hard. Let me say first that I'm a historian and a scholar in that sense, and also by temperament, I prefer first to look at facts and documentation. And obviously, I spent most of my life studying war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, the Holocaust. And so I've seen a great deal of evidence of inhumanity. And while it's, of course, very difficult to take that in, I try to evaluate things first on a factual basis. I try to remain as emotionally detached to maintain a distance. So I'm saying this because while obviously as an Israeli and as a Jew, and I would say also just as a human being, it's devastating to watch what we're watching. The most important thing is to make sure that we get our facts right. And then we can calibrate our emotions according to that, rather than start with emotions and then have the facts fit our emotional state. And now, why is it difficult? I think fundamentally it's difficult because the State of Israel was created in 1948. In fact, the same year that the Genocide Convention was adopted by the UN. As a result, in many ways, or received international recognition in many ways, because of the Holocaust. Because many people around the world, not only Jews, felt that it was time for Jews to have a state of their own, where they could protect themselves, where they would not be a minority. And in fact, that was the core of Zionism. Zionism began in the late 19th century as a movement geared to provide Jews with safety, to have their own place, their own land, their own government, their own army, their own police, so that they would not be a minority that could be threatened by majorities or all kinds of nasty regimes that they might have to live under. And so because of that, because Zionism was created as a movement of liberation and emancipation and appeal to humanitarianism, and because the state itself came into being in the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust, to wrap your mind about the fact that that state is engaged in massive killing of human beings on an unprecedented scale, and in fact unprecedented around the world, at least for the 21st century, is very difficult to take in. It's just, and for everyone. And so, in part, and I say that in part because it's not the only thing, certainly not in Israel, in part that explains denial. That people look for something else to explain this, or to explain it away, or to excuse this. And I can understand that up to a point, because from a certain point on, denial as a sort of intellectual preoccupation is not a good thing. It's not good in personal life, and it's not good in politics, and it's not good to base your entire identity and worldview on denial. And denial also, curiously, has a history vis-a-vis the Holocaust. There are Holocaust deniers. There's a kind of subculture of Holocaust denial, which has always existed, even while it was happening and since. And many Jews, certainly not only Jews, but many Jews view that as particularly pernicious, because that's part of what genocide is about. Genocide is not only about destroying people, it's also destroying their memory. It's destroying the fact that they had existed and then that they were, and how then their existence came to an end. And so denial is problematic. And while we can understand it vis-a-vis what we are seeing in Gaza, it can't be acceptable in the long run.
Walk me through a little bit about the definition of genocide, because I think that will help, because it was, the term genocide has been around, but it was defined in, I believe, 1948 in the wake of everything you've just spoken about. When a lot of people, it's a two-part question, when a lot of people hear genocide, they think about the Holocaust, they think about Rwanda, and I'm wondering, when you explain the definition, if it's a broader umbrella than most people think it is, because I think most people, when they hear these not most people, some people, when they hear these comparisons to genocide, they say, this is not the Holocaust. The context, this is definitely not the Holocaust. There are no concentration camps. We will get into intent and context, but there's no way that this equates to the Holocaust or to something like Rwanda. Talk to me a little bit about the definition of genocide, and if the umbrella of genocide is bigger than most people think, such that when you are referring to this as a genocide, I don't know, but maybe you are not referring to it in the same context as this is a Holocaust.
Okay, so genocide is a term that was invented by a Jewish Polish lawyer called Raphael Lemkin in 1944. Raphael Lemkin started thinking about this unique crime that he identified already in the 1930s, so before the Holocaust, before World War II. He was looking mostly at what happened to the Armenians in World War I. There was a genocide of the Armenians in 1915 that lasted several years, and something up to 1.5 million Armenians were killed as people who were members of or subjects of the Ottoman Empire. And he tried to think, what is that crime? Is that different from a war crime or slaughter or massacre? What is that? And he tried actually to introduce legislation on that in the 1930s and failed. In World War II, he had to escape from Poland because he was Jewish. His entire family was murdered. He made it to the United States. And in the United States, he wrote a big book in which there was a chapter that defined genocide. And that came out in 1944. And once he coined the word genocide, which is a combination of Greek and Latin to say the killing of a genus, the killing of a group, of an ethnic group, he began campaigning, and especially after the end of World War II, to have the term introduced into international law. And he actually went to the Nuremberg Tribunal and tried to push for that. The term surfaced in the tribunal, but it wasn't really in the indictment. But by 1948, he succeeded in having the UN adopt a convention. So that was 1948. It came into force in 1951 when sufficient number of countries signed it. And he understood genocide in a particular way. And his way of understanding it largely is part of the Genocide Convention. So when I say genocide, and when international lawyers say genocide, what they mean is not just killing large numbers of people. They refer to the definition of the UN. That's the only definition that matters under international law. And it does not define the Holocaust. It defines genocide. And what that definition says is the following. It is actions carried out with the intent to destroy a particular group, an ethnic or national or racial or religious group, in whole or in part, as such. That's the definition. And what that means is that there would be actions being taken. They could be killing the group. They could be putting the group under conditions that make its health and its existence very difficult. It would be harming members of the group. It would be preventing deaths for the group with the intent of destroying the group as such, in whole or in part. So you're not killing people or torturing them or preventing births against individuals. You're doing it with a particular overriding goal. And that goal is that that group will no longer exist. And how much is whole or part, of course, is, it's up for grabs. One can debate that. But your goal is for the group to disappear. So if, for instance, you target a particular group and you kill members of it, and then you disperse other members of it to various countries where they lose their language, they lose their traditions, they are alive, but their offspring will no longer know that there was a group or know anything about that group. Thereby you've destroyed that group. That can be perceived as genocide. So that's the definition, and that's the one that has been used since. Now, regarding this, and it's an understandable response. People will say, and I've had that discussion with people in Israel. Let's say, I'll give an example, because I was speaking with Netanyahu's former Minister of Defense and former Chief of Staff, who I happen to have known for over 50 years. And he, in November 2024, said in a TV interview that what Israel was doing in northern Gaza at the time was ethnic cleansing. And the interviewer was quite shocked and said, "Did you just say ethnic cleansing?" Because in Israel, there's a huge amount of denial of all that. And he said, "Yes, what do you think it is?" And about a week later, I came to chat with him. I was in Israel. And he said the same thing. And I said, historically, ethnic cleansing, which is not well defined in international law, is the first stage before genocide. Because when you ethnically cleanse people, you try to move a particular group that you don't want in a particular territory outside of that territory. But often people don't want to leave their homes. It's quite natural. And often they can't. And often they have no place to go to. That's what happened in the Armenian genocide. The Ottoman Empire just wanted to move people out of the Ottoman Empire, but on the way they died in the deserts, they died of thirst. That's what happened in the Holocaust. The Nazi regime initially just wanted the Jews out of Germany, and then out of Austria, and then out of the Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia at the time. And then it took over more and more territory with more and more Jews with less and less place to move them to. And then it started killing them. So I was saying that to him, and I said, that's ethnic cleansing may become genocide. And he said, yes, but there are no shooting pits here. Meaning he immediately, in his own mind, as many people would, was thinking about something like Babi Yar, that you take 30,000 people, put them in front of pits and shoot them, or extermination camps, as you said. But you don't need that to say that it's genocide. And no genocide, modern genocide, was as expansive, as huge in terms of numbers and territory and efficiency and mechanization of killing as the Holocaust. But there were many other genocides. And we see them as genocide. So we can say the Holocaust was a genocide with unique aspects such as extermination camps. But there were many other genocides, and some of those were about destroying a group as such without killing all members of it. And of course, even in the Holocaust, fortunately, not all the Jews were murdered. Otherwise, we wouldn't be around.
That's a really good explanation. And I think the challenge is for a lot of people is a lot of people jump when they hear genocide, and a lot of people who want to call this a genocide and we can talk a little bit about how anti-Semitism is mixed into some of this, because I do believe it is. I imagine you agree that there are rising rates of anti-Semitism. That's a fact as well. But there are a lot of people who, when they hear it, they'll say, yeah, exactly. The Jews are doing exactly what happened to them. And there's this narrative, the people who were the victims in the Holocaust are now the aggressors creating their own Holocaust. And people are quick to take that genocide word and conflate it with Holocaust. And I want to talk about intent and context in a moment, because that's obviously important, and that's something you alluded to. But I guess before I do that, I just want to ask, why is it so important to label this a genocide? Understanding that most people, not everybody, but many people, when they hear genocide, look at it as a black and white term. Look at it as what I kind of call a conversation ender. When you hear genocide, it immediately casts Israel as the villains and Gaza as the good guys, so to speak, who are dying. And it really takes a situation that I think you would agree, or many people would agree, is very complex, very gray. And by having the word genocide, it can make it feel so black and white, such that the context and the intent don't matter. So why is that particular word so important, as opposed to just saying Israel's done some bad things in this war, there's been war crimes? Why is that distinction so important?
So let me first say that genocide is a black and white term. That is, there is no, and there cannot be any justification for genocide. And it doesn't matter what was done to you. All countries and organizations that carried out genocide believed, first of all, they often didn't say it was genocide. They often said there was a security risk. There were enemies from within, even when they were carrying out. But they always also saw themselves as victims. They were carrying out genocide to protect themselves. They were destroying a group that they thought would destroy them. And I can go through all the genocides of the 20th century, and all of them have this element. Genocide is not excusable, is not justifiable. It is black and white. Anyone who carries out genocide, even if it's in response to genocide, is still to be condemned. And it doesn't matter whether you invented it, whether it's half-truth, whether it's whole truth, genocide cannot be justified. That's really important to understand. Now, why is it important to say that something is genocide? As I said before, there is a genocide convention. It is an important part of international law. Most states in the world, including the United States and the State of Israel, are signatories of the Genocide Convention. What does that mean, that you're a signatory to the Genocide Convention? It means, if you read the convention, it means that if you, as a state, identify that a genocide is about to happen, you're duty-bound to try and stop it, even if it's happening in a sovereign country, which is not your own. It's the only international law that allows that, to intervene in the affairs of a sovereign country. If a genocide is happening, you're duty-bound to try and stop it. And after it happens, you're duty-bound to punish those who carried it out. So it is a very strong international law. And when you say that, it is different from saying, well, there are war crimes. There are always crimes in war. They're never justifiable. People who carry them out should be punished. But there is no international convention with that kind of force as there is regarding genocide. Secondly, when you say about a country that it carried out genocide, or that is carrying out genocide, genocide is not something that is carried out just by a few people. In war crimes, you could have some army brigade that went rogue and carried out war crimes. So we have to think who commanded it, why it happened, what were the circumstances. Genocide is a social event. When a country carries out genocide, everybody in that country, in one way or another, becomes complicit. That's why it's so difficult to punish for genocide, because you can't punish an entire country unless you respond by another genocide. At the end of World War II, you couldn't punish all the Germans for the Holocaust and all the many other crimes that you had to choose a few people as representative and try them. because it's impossible so it's, in many ways, it's a crime that most people get away with. So when you identify that, you realize that that crime, it becomes a social event and it projects into the future. A country that is found guilty of genocide, this is a generational stain. This is not something that will go away tomorrow. We finish the war, we killed how many people we killed, and we move on. It does not go away. And so it is a very particular and a very severe allegation, and it should be made only when you're quite sure that the facts warrant that kind of allegation.
I want to get into some of the particulars now about what's going on, specifically about intent, and then we'll talk a little bit about context. And you just spoke a little bit about intent in a comment from somebody in the senior government that you've known for 50 years. In the article that you wrote in the Times, I'll read a couple of the comments you wrote. You point to both comments made by Israeli officials and to actions by the IDF that demonstrate intent. So some of the comments, Netanyahu said the enemy would pay a huge price, the IDF would turn parts of Gaza into rubble. Other government officials say we are fighting human animals, calls for a, quote, total annihilation. Nissim Vaturi, the deputy speaker of parliament, he said the task must be to, quote, erase the Gaza Strip from the face of the earth. Now, those are damning comments. Do you believe that reflects the general Israeli ethos and was a set-out policy by the administration, or just off-the-cuff remarks, rogue comments, rhetoric that was used partially in the emotional period right after October 7th? Because bad actors and rhetoric aside, I guess, do you believe in the overall integrity of Israel still, or if you ever did, or do you think that there has been a specific policy in place? Because you also said to me there that genocide is not something that is carried out by just a few people. So talk to me a little bit about that and whether you view this as the Israeli ethos, or would it be reasonable for somebody to say, yeah, those comments are bad comments, but that doesn't actually reflect what's in the hearts of the IDF soldiers or of the Israeli people or of the policy that's been put into place over the last 2 years?
Right. So you're really asking two questions. One is the question of intent, and the other is the question of a sort of national ethos, or the mentality of the state, or at least parts of it. On the question of intent, so intent is a crucial part of recognizing genocide. So there could be war crimes being carried out, and you would identify them as war crimes. Let's say you drop a very large bomb on a school in which there are hundreds of displaced people hiding because you think that there are some militants hiding under that school. And that could be seen as a war crime because it's disproportionate. You're using disproportionate force for that particular goal, and thereby you're killing disproportionate numbers of innocent civilians. If you're doing that just as such, it would be a war crime. If you're doing it under the overriding understanding that there is an intent, a genocidal intent, it could also be part of a genocidal operation. So intent really matters here. How do you discern intent? So the easiest way is that people with executive authority, heads of state, ministers of defense, ministers of police, generals, say that that's what they want to do, that they want to eradicate the group. They won't give them any food, they won't give them any water. If they use dehumanizing language, they call them cockroaches or vermin or human animals or monsters. That's one way to discern that there is an intent, and expressed intent. It's also the kind of intent that when you express, you say as a minister of defense, your soldiers know that you said that because it's on the radio, it's on TV. And they then, what do you expect them to do if your minister of defense says these are human animals, they should be treated as such? So there's an element of incitement in such speech as well, which actually is also criminal. So that's one way. And often states don't say that. they say something else. They say we have to fight for existence, we have to fight against our enemies, and so forth. That's why it's difficult to discern intent. In the case of Israel, it wasn't so difficult because all those people jumped up and spoke out very quickly. The second way is through a pattern of operations. Because, as I said, often states and organizations won't say that that's what they're doing. So you have to look at what they are actually doing. And if you can see that the pattern of operations indicates a particular intent, then you can combine that to show that there is a genocidal intent. Now, in the case of Israel specifically, there were these, what you cited in many other statements that were said at the time and actually have been said since over and over again. And we can quote from just the last few weeks many statements of that type. But initially, when I heard those statements, like you and like many others, I said, okay, Israeli politicians are often a bit out of control and they use very extreme language and they're mad because look at the horrors that happened on October 7th. It was a massacre. It was a war crime. Hundreds of civilians were massacred. The government was incompetent. The army couldn't get its act together. There was a lot of rage. But then the government also said what its war goals were. And the war goals, the official war goals, were completely different. They said, war goals is to destroy Hamas and to release the hostages. And that appeared quite reasonable. That's, you were attacked and that's your war goals. There are 251 hostages and Hamas is an organization that everybody around the world would be happy to see disappear, including most of the Arab world. So then, for me, initially, and as you know, in November of 23, I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, and I said, it looks like they're war crimes. It looks like they're crimes against humanity. 10,000 people by then had been killed already. But I'm not sure it's genocide. I'm just afraid that it may become that soon, if it's not stopped. Now, it wasn't stopped. And by May of the following year, of 2024, to me, it became clear that there was indeed a pattern of operations. And that pattern of operations was not the one that reflected these official war goals, that is to destroy Hamas and release the hostages. In fact, Hamas was not destroyed and the hostages were not released. Both these goals failed until today, almost 2 years later, but rather reflected those statements made in the immediate aftermath of October 7th. To eradicate Gaza, to destroy it completely, to make it uninhabitable for its population. So when we look now, for instance, at the fact that there is no food, you can take that all the way back to the statement made by Yoav Gallant, I think on October 8th, in which he said, they will have no water, they will have no food, they will have no power. They're human animals and they should be treated as such. That is, that there was a logic that was actually expressed at that time that was then reflected in what the IDF has been involved in. And that is an indication not only that people said what they said, but that they meant what they said and that they were and are implementing it as we speak.
You said the operations so far haven't really reflected the official war goals. I want to unpack that a little bit more because it's tough to, first of all, it's tough to know what's facts and what's not because it's just, there's so much reporting coming out, some of which is excellent reporting, some of which is not good reporting, to be blunt. In terms of the challenges Israel's faced to know if they're actually trying to get rid of Hamas and if they're trying to get the hostages back, if those are authentic goals, which I guess you're questioning. If I'm just looking at the context here, you've got October 7th, obviously, as the inciting event. You then have the context of Hamas's extensive tunnel system, pattern of using civilians as shields, hiding hostages amongst civilians, hoarding, at least it's to be believed, a lot of the food in the tunnels, which has led to this kind of debate as to what's the best way to get aid in to the Gazan people. And you've got Hamas, which is very, very difficult to negotiate with, despite a lot of offers on the table. Israel, you could say, has also been difficult to negotiate with, but even I think many Arab countries would agree Hamas is notoriously difficult to negotiate with. What my question is that I hear a lot when I'm debating this with people or just having conversations is even though you said before, which is an important point I think that I want to highlight, that there is no excuse for genocide. You can commit a genocide even if it's in response to a genocide. And we know that Hamas is genocidal. So just because Hamas is genocidal against Israel and the Jews, it doesn't mean that Israel can't be committing a genocide in response. But the question I often hear is, what is Israel supposed to do? What is the response supposed to be in order to get those hostages back, in order to defeat Hamas? Whenever somebody kind of says Israel's gone too far, the response will be, well, do you have a suggestion of what Israel should do in order to achieve its measures? Now, it sounds like you question whether the actual intentions of getting the hostages back and defeating Hamas are legitimate. But assuming for a moment those are legitimate, because maybe they're not, but to a degree, I think for many people in the government and for many Jews, those probably feel legitimate. What is Israel supposed to do when facing an enemy that is almost impossible to defeat? What would you propose as the alternative to people who say, what is Israel supposed to do in this situation?
So first, I mean, you use the word legitimate. The goals are legitimate. That's not, my question is not whether the goal to defeat Hamas and release the hostages is legitimate.
Sorry, I'll rephrase it. I guess you question whether that's actually what
Correct.
The goals are. Those
Correct.
are legitimate goals, but is that actually what the government wants?
Exactly. So you're using legitimate in a more sort of colloquial way. But yeah, the goals are legitimate. The question is whether these are the goals that the government is pursuing. And I question that. I'm not the only one who questions it. So that's just generally. So let me start a little back, because there's a lot in what you said. In 2015, Zale Mednick made a speech in which he said that Hamas was an asset. And he said, why is it an asset? Because the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, although it's weak and corrupt and unpopular, has international legitimacy. It's recognized in the world. Hamas, although it's much more powerful, it has no legitimacy. The entire world speaks about it as a terrorist organization. So for us, he said, having Hamas is a good thing, because as long as Hamas is in power, we can say that we have nobody to speak with on the Palestinian side. Because they have Hamas, and Hamas doesn't want peace with Israel. Hamas wants to create an Islamic State in Palestine. Netanyahu's whole policy until October 7th, for years and years, was to keep Hamas in power. In fact, as we know, he had an agreement with Qatar that was providing millions of dollars to Hamas, which were handed over by Israel in money bags to keep Hamas in power. Why? Because as long as Hamas was there, Netanyahu could sell what he sold not only to the Israeli public, but to the rest of the world, that the occupation could be maintained, could be managed, that there was no other way but to, we'll occupy them, we'll surround them by a fence, we'll besiege them. But generally, there's no one to speak with because Hamas is there. And Hamas used a lot of that money, indeed, to build a whole tunnel structure. Money that was provided by Israel, now, or handed over by Israel. Now, October 7th blew all this up, right? That was over. Okay, you can't manage the occupation. And initially, obviously, the government and the IDF were quite shocked by what happened. But a few days later, Netanyahu and Ben Gvir and Smotrich, the people to his right, suddenly realized that while it was really bad, first of all, it was bad because there was a massacre, and secondly, it was really bad for them because the fiasco was on them. I realized that it was also an opportunity. And why was it an opportunity? Now they had license to go and use the other way of solving the Palestinian question, to just get rid of them, to throw them out. Now, why is the war still going on? The war, by all accounts, at the latest, ended in May of 2024. And some people will tell you already in January. The IDF reached its goals. It destroyed the leadership of Hamas. It destroyed all its structure. Hamas is no longer an organized, and hasn't been for a year at least, an organized military organization. There are some guerrillas who will always be there, and they'll be there whatever you do. So why is the war still going on? Because Netanyahu has refused to say what he wants to do next. The army has actually been asking him for months, tell us what to do. We are just moving in circles. We don't know what to do. All the IDF is doing in Gaza is demolishing houses. It's doing it itself, and it's doing it with contractors who are being brought from Israel and being paid a lot of money by the house to use heavy equipment, bulldozers and so forth, to flatten all of Gaza. Because if he said, okay, we won the war, we have accomplished full victory, who is going to take over Gaza? Who will rule in Gaza? Not Hamas. Okay, Hamas, obviously, maybe they'll move the leadership to Libya. But who then will rule the Gaza Strip? And the only people who can do it are Palestinians. No one will take it over unless it's the IDF itself, unless it's Israel. And the IDF definitely does not want to do it. It doesn't have the manpower. It'll cost a huge amount of money and blood. And for Netanyahu and Smotrich and Ben-Gvir and many other people in the Likud party as well, that's a nightmare. That's the nightmare scenario, because they want the land, but they don't want the people in it. They want those people to go away. And so now you ask, so what could Israel have done after October 7th? Obviously, it had to do something. And the goal was, these goals were legitimate. Destroy Hamas, release our hostages. How do you do that? Well, you don't do that by committing genocide in Gaza. That will kill the hostages, and many of them have died, and will not destroy Hamas. It'll just empty the land completely. You do it by saying, as this government and previous governments in Israel have refused to say, you say, Hamas is our enemy. Hamas is not a friend of the Palestinians either. If you, people in Gaza, help us destroy Hamas, we promise you that after we destroy Hamas, we will help you build a different kind of society. We will help you rebuild Gaza. We will help you connect with your Palestinian brothers in the West Bank. We will help you create some kind of entity where you will be able to live with dignity, with a decent life, with equal rights. But that's not what this government wanted to do. And I'll give you one analogy, because people talk about that a lot. You know, in World War II, the U.S. Air Force and the RAF bombed the hell out of Germany. They bombed open cities. They killed 600,000 people with strategic bombing. And the leaders, British and American leaders, kept saying, we are fighting the Nazi regime, we are not fighting the German people. But they believed that if they bombed those cities, maybe the German people would rise up and get rid of the Nazi regime. Of course, they didn't, and they couldn't. But when the war ended and Germany was occupied by Americans, by the British, by the Soviets, they didn't kill all those Germans. They didn't put them in concentration camps. What they did was the Marshall Plan. What they did was to revive Germany, to rebuild Germany. They re-educated. It wasn't a very successful re-education, but they at least proclaimed re-education. If Israel had said that, it would have been a completely different war. It would have been over by now, long ago, of course. But that's not the goal. So again, if you look at the pattern, you realize that these legitimate goals were not the goals and are not the goals that Israel is pursuing right now. In fact, the only thing that is keeping the IDF from completely eradicating Gaza is the fact that there's still about 20 live or barely live hostages there. And the IDF is highly reluctant to move into those last remaining areas. There's only 25% of the Gaza Strip is not occupied by the IDF. So 2 million people have now been crammed into a quarter of the territory of the Strip, which was one of the most densely populated areas in the world before the war. And the hostages are somewhere there. And that's the only thing that's keeping the IDF from moving in, although Smotrich and Ben-Gvir say you should move in and never mind the hostages.
Do you think that Israel could get those hostages if they wanted to right now? Some
Yes.
people listening will say...
They could
Some
have.
people listening right now will say, sure, I'll accept your argument that Hamas is defeated. The war ended in May 2024. And it sounds like you're conceding even that you don't trust Netanyahu and the government, it seems, and many people don't in terms of what their actual goals are. But let's assume for a second their goals were actually what they stated publicly at some points of defeating Hamas and getting the hostages back. People listening would say, but they still have the hostages. So I interrupted you, but tell me, how would they have gotten the hostages back now? Because that might, that's a sticking point, understandably, for a lot of people who say, but they still have our hostages.
Of course, of course. In May 2024, President Biden, you may remember, said that Israel and Hamas had agreed to a deal of 2 phases, in which part of the hostages would return, and then phase 2, in which the other part would return, in return for Palestinian prisoners. And one usually doesn't mention that, but I mention it anyway, that among the Palestinian prisoners who are described in Israel as terrorists, there are large numbers of people who are in administrative arrest, meaning that we don't know what they were charged with. They don't know what they were charged with because they never had a hearing or a trial. But they've been kept for a long time in Israeli jails. So that was the deal. The deal was to return the hostages, give Hamas large numbers of prisoners, and end the war. And then Netanyahu said, well, okay, let's start. And then he refused to implement phase 2. That was the same thing that happened in January. Now, as President Trump moved in, Trump forced Netanyahu clearly to agree to a ceasefire. The ceasefire had several phases, and Netanyahu agreed to have those phases. And at the end of phase 1, or even before phase 1 ended, he unilaterally broke the ceasefire in March, killing hundreds of people with a surprise air raid, and continued doing what they're doing now. And we know that Hamas, at least since May 2024, and I'm not saying it because I want to support Hamas, I'm just saying it because these are the facts, said, we are willing to exchange everyone for everyone, all our prisoners for all your hostages, on condition of ending the war. And Netanyahu has never agreed to that. And every time there's a negotiation, he puts some stick in the wheels. He always breaks it at the last moment. Why? So the explanation is often that he does it because if he agrees to an end of the war, he will lose his coalition, and then there will be elections, then there'll be a commission of inquiry, which he has been always against because he will be found, of course, the main responsible party to the fiasco of October 7th, and he's under indictment for corruption and so forth. But I don't think that's the only reason for Netanyahu. It's one reason. But the other reason is that he actually now wants to implement this plan, this other plan. And he is well on the way. And you have to remember, in early May 2025, Netanyahu spoke very clearly about that. He said, we are destroying their houses. They will have no place to return to. When we put up these 4 distribution points for 2 million people, which, again, Israel did after several weeks of no food at all being delivered, and these 4 distribution points were obviously not enough, and that's why there's such a lack of food in Gaza. They organized 3 of these 4 points were in the south. And the idea was that people would go there and not be able to come back, so that it would gradually move the population from the northern and central Gaza to southern Gaza. And Netanyahu said they should come there, but they won't be able to go back because we're destroying their houses. And then a couple of weeks ago, the Minister of Defense, Israel Katz, spoke about creating a humanitarian city. A humanitarian city where? Over the ruins of Rafah, for 600,000 people who would be able to enter it. It won't be a city, it'll be, of course, an encampment, it'll be tents. They'll be able to enter it, but they won't be allowed to leave it. So creating a vast concentration camp whose perimeter would be guarded by the IDF, but who would supply the food there? It would not be the state of Israel, it would be someone else. And people could leave it only if they leave the strip altogether. These are the plans that are being talked about in Israel. And this has nothing to do with what has been on the table, at least since May last year. That if and all the hostage families know that and talk about it. Give everyone back. Netanyahu always insisted on not everyone. We'll take some of the hostages back, but not all of them. Why? Because if all of them come back, that's the end of it. And he does not want it to end. He wants it to continue. It sounds extraordinarily cynical and brutal, but that's what it is.
Some would say Yahweh Sinwar was a hostage who was released many years ago, and he was the architect of October 7th. So it's easy to say we can give all of the prisoners back in exchange for the hostages, but then it's also reasonable to say, well, from the Israeli standpoint, last time we gave back, I forget how many it was, 1,000 hostages, 1,000 prisoners for Gilad Shalit. One of those people ended up being the architect of October 7th. So how would you respond to that?
Look, I mean, that's a decision that one has to make. And you can say, they're hostages, I'm not releasing any prisoners, and I give up on the hostages. And there's a debate over that in Israel. Many Israelis, including people on the right, say the state of Israel, like any state, but more than many other states, because it's a state created after the Holocaust and because of the sort of ideology of Zionism, has an obligation to protect its own citizens. And it reneged on that obligation on October 7th. It did not protect them. It did not do what it ought to have done. It did not defend them. And it has an obligation at any price, first of all, to get the hostages back. Then you can do whatever you need to do. But first of all, you must bring those people back. So that's I think, an important element. But if you want to think about the more structural aspect of this, why do we have all of this? Why is all of this happening? And all of this is happening, you have to remember, since 1967, Israel is a country, half of whose population are people who don't have equal rights. Today, in that territory between the Jordan and the sea, you have 7 million Jews and 7 million Palestinians. Of those 7 million Palestinians, 2 million are Israeli citizens who hypothetically have the same rights, but they don't. And there's a nationality law, nation-state law that actually states it since 2018, but they never had full rights. And they lived for 2 decades under military rule and so forth. Then you have 3 million Palestinians in the West Bank. They have no rights. They live under military rule. They can be arrested, children aged 12 can be arrested and thrown into jail without a trial for as long as Israel wants. And then you have 2 million in the Gaza Strip, and we know what's going on there. If you create a situation like this over decades, what do you expect will happen? People who live like that, with Gaza having been under an Israeli siege for 16 years before October 7th, that will radicalize people. They will behave in murderous ways. They will become brutal. Because you treat them like animals, they will behave like animals. And because you treat others like animals, you too will be brutalized in return. That situation, that precondition has to change. And it cannot be changed with bombs. It has to be changed with politics. So beyond all these things, the hostages here and, all these sort of tactical questions, you have to deal with the core issue. The core issue is that in Israel, as the space that he rules, is a space in which half of the people have no rights, and the Israeli public doesn't even think that they have a right to have rights. It does not think of them as fellow human beings. And that is corrupting. It's not only harmful, of course, to the people who occupy it, it corrupts your society. And what you see now in Israel is a very rapid, right now, erosion of civil liberties, of the rule of law, of freedom of speech, more and more police violence, not only against Arabs, but also against Jews. And eventually a country that will become authoritarian and will resemble something like Hungary, rather than what we think of as a liberal democracy.
The last question I want to ask you is, in regards to anti-Semitism to an extent, there is, as I said earlier in the podcast, raging amounts of anti-Semitism. I mean, on October 7th, on October 8th, before Israel had even retaliated, people were chanting death to Israel, death to the Jews. There is a lot of anti-Semitism in the world. I'm sure you agree with that, and that has increased substantially over the past couple of years. How do you square what's going on in Gaza with Israel's, and to an extent Jews worldwide, who do feel that there is an existential threat towards them? Now, you said earlier there is no justification for genocide, and I think you made that clear, and that argument was coherent. But for many Jews and many Israelis, I think the sentiment, I don't want to speak for Jews and Israelis, but I think the sentiment is, we are so worried about anti-Semitism, and we are so worried about another Holocaust, we are so worried about people hating us and wanting to destroy us, that we literally need to do, kind of, as bad as it sounds, anything necessary in order to preserve ourselves. What would you say in response to that mentality, if you agree that that is a mentality that exists amongst many Jews and Israelis in the world?
Well, look, first of all, I mean, I must say American Jews who say that, if they actually think that, then why did they go to Israel and do it themselves? I mean, I find that to be kind of a cop-out. People sitting, in California and saying, well, Israel should kill all the Palestinians in Gaza because there's anti-Semitism in the United States. That's a weird argument to me. You want to do it, go join the IDF and do it yourself. Don't be a hero in your, as they say in Israel, in your air-conditioned room. But beyond that, look, anti-Semitism existed before the State of Israel, will exist if the State of Israel does not exist. It's been around for a long time. Committing genocide in Gaza is not going to make anti-Semitism go away. In fact, it's only going to increase it. If Israel behaves the way it does, it's giving license to anti-Semitism around the world. It's inciting anti-Semitism. In fact, the main cause, the immediate trigger for rising anti-Semitism now is the way the State of Israel is behaving, the impunity with which it is behaving brutally toward another group. But there's another aspect to anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is a real thing. It exists, but it's also something that is seen differently by different people. Israel, for quite a while, has pushed a particular definition of anti-Semitism, the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, that is now accepted in various places in the US and in Germany. And if you look at that definition of anti-Semitism, the definition itself is fine. Of course, if someone acts against people they perceive as Jewish, just because they're Jewish, that's anti-Semitism. Or if they attribute to them opinions and qualities and so forth, yes, that's clearly anti-Semitic. But that definition has 11 examples of anti-Semitic speech, and of those 11 examples, 7 have to do with the state of Israel. And so what has happened is that there has been a drive, not least by Israel, to make criticism of Israel, whether it's mild criticism or very strong criticism, even anti-Zionism, as equivalent to anti-Semitism. That is a serious problem. It means that people like me, for instance, who served for 4 years in the IDF, could be said to be anti-Semitic because I'm very strongly critical of Israeli policies. That is against freedom of speech. It's against anything that we ought to believe in, and it's not anti-Semitic. Now, you could say that somebody could be both anti-Semitic and critical of Israeli policies. That's obviously possible. But the attempt that we saw very strongly last spring to silent speech, silent protest against Israel by calling those protests anti-Semitic, even though many of those protesters were Jews themselves, not a few of them my own students. That is dangerous. It's dangerous because it actually gives license to real anti-Semitism. And as somebody who studied anti-Semitism a fair amount, I can tell you the roots of anti-Semitism are on the right. They're not in the left. There are always people on the left, on the margins, who have anti-Semitic opinion. But the main force of anti-Semitism is the same of racism, of xenophobia. That's where it comes from. It comes always from the right. Those who murdered large numbers of Jews were not on the left. They were always on the right. And if you use the allegation of anti-Semitism to shut down speech, you are giving license to those real anti-Semites, many of whom are people who, those who talk against protests against Israel and call them anti-Semitic, often they're people who have pretty good anti-Semitic credentials themselves. And so that sort of confusion between criticism of the state of Israel, even of Zionism, there are vast numbers of Jews around the world who are anti-Zionist or non-Zionist, but they're obviously not anti-Semitic. Most Orthodox Jews are not Zionist. The ultra-Orthodox, they're members of the cabinet, of the Israeli cabinet, who are non-Zionist, but they're still in the cabinet. But they believe, that the Zionism is a sin, because you have to wait for the redemption before the Jews can go back. So they actually look at the state of Israel in which they live as a sort of foreign entity. So using these arguments to silent criticism of Israel, to silent criticism of the indefensible, of the oppression of people, of killing people, of humiliating people. It's not as bad as killing people, but there is something in that whole argument which I find particularly nasty, particularly insidious, and it can lead to a kind of McCarthyism, using allegations of anti-Semitism in order just to put people in their place, to fight against whatever wokeism or liberalism or whatever one wants to destroy in the name of fakely arguing that one is protecting Jews.
So this idea of overly conflating anything anti-Israel is anti-Semitic, essentially?
I don't know if it's anti-Semitic, but it certainly gives license to anti-Semitism. And I actually worry about that, because there is a rise in anti-Semitism. There's one thing that one needs to be careful about, because part of these surveys of how much anti-Semitism there is and how much it has risen, one always has to check, how do you define that thing? So if you see people marching around campus carrying a Palestinian flag, which is an internationally recognized flag, and you say that shows a rise in anti-Semitism, then it's one thing, right? I mean, I was asked about, is there anti-Semitism at Brown University, right? And I said, well, it depends. If your premise is that criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic, there's a lot of anti-Semitism. If you say that's not the way you define anti-Semitism, but anti-Semitism is actually attacking Jews as Jews, not for their opinion, but just because they're Jews, then there's none. I've seen none of it. So some of what the ADL has put out are obviously manipulated figures to try and both show that there's a rise in anti-Semitism because that's their job, to show that it's there, but much more importantly, to conflate criticism of Israel with actual anti-Semitism.
And one thing I didn't go into, and obviously we could chat about this for a very long time, is one thing I didn't go into is a lot of people would say, and I think there's merit to it, is that Brown University example is how many other causes are people standing up for with this much vigor for, right? A lot of Jews feel like anytime Israel does something wrong, people are ready to march against Israel because there are anti-Semitic rooted feelings in a lot of people. And that's the cause they're going to say, yep, we're going to stand up and do this for. So,
and as opposed to what? I mean, as opposed to what? What should people demonstrate about?
I guess you could look at when things were going on in Syria, Assad. You could look at Sudan right now. I'm not unfortunately a historian or a journalist, so I wish I had more particulars. But there are other examples out there of horrendous things that have.
So, what do you think is the difference between what is happening in Somalia or Syria or Russia or China? I mean, these are places where there's obviously crimes against humanity, potentially genocide. What's the difference between the state of Israel and Somalia or Russia or China?
I think what other people would say, and I don't want to overly stretch my opinions based on my knowledge of my education, but I think what a lot of people would say is people don't really seem to care about publicizing those issues as much or standing up on college campuses as much about that because potentially anti-Semitism is a reason why they gravitate towards criticizing Israel. And that doesn't justify if Israel is doing something bad, which is why I decided in our limited time together, I didn't want to bring that up as a point because just because other bad things are going on in the world doesn't mean what Israel's bad things are.
Well, let me just sort of try to conclude on this, but I want to stress one thing. One reason, one main difference between the state of Israel and all these other states that we mentioned, China, Syria, Somalia, is that Israel has presented itself always as the villain in the jungle, as the representative of Western civilization and democracy and human rights in the Middle East, that its main allies are European countries and the United States, which is a recipient of vast amounts of support, certainly military, but also political cover by the United States and by Europe. And in that sense, there's a vast difference between it. Also, much of this is being paid by American taxpayers, all these airplanes and bombs and all that, that Israel is being showered with, and then that it drops on Gaza. You can't say that about Somalia. I don't know that they're being supported by the U.S. or Russia or Syria. And so when you are a state that claims to be a sort of oasis of democracy, that claims to be a sort of liberal haven in the Middle East, and that receives so much support from the West, it's not surprising that young people in the United States will say, look, this is our ally. And our parents, maybe not the students, but their parents are paying a lot of tax money for that, and that state is out of control, and they'd be more exercised over that than over what's happening in Somalia. Not that they shouldn't protest about it. I agree. But it is much more relevant. And what is extraordinary about it, too, is that the United States could have actually stopped much of this right at the beginning. In November, December of 2023, President Biden could have actually put an end to this because Israel is so dependent on the United States. The IDF would not have been able to fight a war for more than 3 weeks without constant supply of shells, of bombs, of interceptor missiles from the United States. And that supply continued on and on and on. That's much more difficult to stop Russia, as we know. It's much more difficult to stop Somalia because, I mean, you know, these are... so in that sense, it does actually, it seems reasonable that Americans would be more focused on that country than on other rogue countries around the world.
Well, Omer Bartov, thank you so much for spending this time with me. I really, really appreciate it. It's a very difficult topic to discuss. It's complex, and I really appreciate you spending this time with me. To learn more about Omer Bartov, you can just type him in on Google, but if you want to read his article that was a feature in the New York Times, just look up Omer Bartov in the New York Times and you'll find his article. Omer, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
So that was Omer Bartov expressing his views on the situation. On next week's podcast, I'm going to be joined by Jeffrey Herf, who's going to provide his viewpoints on why he believes this is not a genocide in Gaza and why he opposes that perspective. For now, thank you very much for listening to this episode. Thank you for supporting Preconceived. Have a great day.